All right, well, welcome back to our series on the architecture of reality. We're going to be talking about astrology today, and because we're going to be looking at the way uh, medievals conceived of the influence that the world had on their lives and on their opportunities and on their personality, that sort of thing. And hopefully, what it does is opens up our eyes to the ways that we as moderns begin to see the understanding of the influence of the world on us, because there is no way to live as if there isn't an interconnected influence between the world and ourself, or our conception of ourself, or our personality, those sorts of things. But in our own day, those particulars, the way that it happens, actually becomes invisible to us because it's assumed by everyone. Whereas, so looking at the astrology of the medievals, which was, if you can put it this way, it was a very Christian understanding of astrology. um, I think can help us see the ways that our own day has a similar sort of understanding of influence. It's not from the stars necessarily, but it's from other things. But because it's invisible to us and it wasn't invisible to them, we don't Christianize it as readily, because we just sort of let it slip past, whereas they understood the metaphor system that they lived in, or the cosmology that they believed in, and so they were constantly working to make sure that they were baptizing their understanding of influence, or submitting their understanding of influence to the scriptures. Because in medieval literature, the influences of constellations and planets was assumed. It was assumed, more in the Middle Ages than it was necessarily in the ancient world. In the ancient world, sometimes you have a deep understanding of the influences of the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the constellation, and sometimes you don't. But in the Middle Ages, it's almost always assumed the cosmos, because the cosmos was seen as a harmonious, interconnected system, and so celestial bodies played a really important role in the development of who we were and what the world was going to like. Planets and constellations were they governed the physical phenomenon, the tides. They understood the connection between the tides and the planets, the weather, but also human human temperaments, and even sometimes destinies. But they didn't think of destiny in a mechanistic sense. So uh, they, but all of creation was ordered in uh, a hierarchical structure, but not hierarchical by means of uh, being, but by means of authority. So uh, the planets, they believed that the planets were like a parade. They marched through the sky and put on display their glories as a way of reflecting the glories of their creator, and by doing that, they had a spiritual or mystical force. They just called it an influence. Our word influenza comes from their understanding of influence. So the same sort of way a germ, um, or a cold is affected on us. It affects us. The planets had that same sort of thing where you go, oh, it's just there's just sort of an influence in my whole body. Well, you've got the flu, you've got influenza, um, and you don't. Uh, and we have taken it down to, or we tend to say, well, a germ causes influenza, but really, it's our body's reaction, um, that is a lot of what a lot of the experience of having the flu is actually experiencing our body's reaction to to this influence that it's trying to purge, expurgate from us. Um, so the planets had that sort of influence, as well as the zodiac signs. And if you got to remember that the sun and the moon were considered planets. So the seven visible planets plus the signs of the zodiac, and the signs of the zodiac are the constellations that the sun and the moon move through on their path. Right. That's what the constellations are. There's 12 signs, and they are uh, associated kind of with the months. They're the zodiac months where the sun and the moon are, or where the sun is rising. What zodiac sign is the sun rising in? Well, through, you've got this in literature. You've got Chaucer. He's got the Physician's Tale, which explains it, but each of the people that tell a story in Chaucer is also associated with a constellation or a planet. You know, you've got there the uh, the people on that are heading out on their pilgrimage are all symbolically related to the zodiac. So the entirety of Chaucer is really about the way different zodiacs influence us, or different constellations of the zodiac influence us. Obviously, in Dante, the whole the final book, the Paradiso, is a trip through the celestial and planetary order. But he uses it more to reflect on the moral order, or the spiritual order, or the intended order that God has for the world, where each of the spheres of heaven he uses to think through a particular virtue, and then even in authors like Geoffrey of Monmouth, you've got an understanding of the way important events in history relate to astronomy or astrology. That it's not just individuals, but societies are also influenced. So they really believed that there was a deep influence between what was going on in the heavens and what was going on Earth, that it was an interconnected relationship. And but they didn't think of it in a deterministic way. In fact, they would often say that it was a rejection of God's rule to think deterministically, that the planets and the constellations and the influence that they had was part of the way that God governed. He governed by means, and so any sort of determinism was condemned. So free will was never overridden by celestial influence, um, even though astrology was sometimes used to explain maybe tendencies or opportunities, but it wasn't like there's these fixed outcomes that astrology brought about. And that's because they really believed there was a deeply integrated understanding of the intellectual life, the spiritual life, even artistic, the what made somebody an artist, and the specific influences. You have the moon that influenced growth, reproduction, cycles of change. It was considered feminine because a woman goes through reproductive cycles the same way, at about the same rate that the moon goes around the Earth. And later you have sort of the Victorians pick some of this up and they create the werewolf, which is that when something when the relationship with the moon goes terribly wrong, you've got this monthly monster that shows up. You've got some the under you know the moon was seen as feminine, and and it influenced when things were good. It influenced reproduction, growth, the tides, um, and uh, and then the ability to change. So which when it's out of control is unstable, but that ability to change and grow is also a good thing when it's in control, right? So when you realize that something's wrong and you are able to change it, that's the positive influence of the moon. And you've got Mercury, who was associated with communication, intelligence, cunning, in which, there's a good sense of cunning, when you really understand how things work and how people work, how to come in to a capitalistic situation and everybody leaves happy. Well, that's the influence. That's when somebody's under the influence of Mercury, public speaking, writing. Uh, but then when it's negative, it's trickery and deceit. And then Venus, love, beauty, harmony, pleasure, romance, sensuality, marriage, relationships, art, and then aesthetic refinement. Somebody that is well associated with Mercury or under the influence of Mercury really understands peace and balance in art. But then when it goes wrong, it's indulgence and lust. And the sun uh, is associated with masculinity and vitality and authority and illumination, understanding and knowing and understanding things well. You, Kingship and creativity uh, are all associated with the sun, and Mars is war and aggression, courage. When somebody is very passionate about justice, that's passionate in the sense that they'll fight for it. Um, and when there's ambition in a good sense, but then also the destructive nature of ambition that is not tempered by love. So you can have the bravery and strength, but also indiscriminate violence or outbursts of anger. Those are all things associated with Mars. Jupiter, the influence of Jupiter is associated with morality and leadership and the magnanimity, the good king. It's also associated with the growth of spring, the breakthrough of spring, and the resurrection of spring, and a, a, a religiously devoted king would be said to be under the influence of Jupiter, right? Because their rule and their reign is tempered by magnanimity and justice and wanting what's best for others. And then Saturn is melancholy, which that comes the kind of understanding of the world that comes with age. So Father Time is basically what is Saturn in the way that we talk in our modern age, but also death, the cloaked figure with the scythe. Those things all are they are symbols that we continue to use that grew out of the symbol of Saturn. It was the boundary of the planets, is the furthest away, and so it held together everything, or it was the edge. And so structure, being responsible, persevering through hardship and sorrow, um, and continuing to do what's right, those were all the good side of Saturn. But it also the mortality, death, and melancholy, are also associated with Saturn as well. So you really have um, this understanding that the planets, depending on where they are and depending on um, the the humors in your body as they understood it, the different um, the different balances within your body, that there was an influence exerted. Now, um, it's easy to sort of dismiss this, but in the modern world, we actually have a similar sort of understanding. It's just not a cosmologically integrated understanding. There's all sorts of things that the way that we think of the influence of vitamins and minerals in our life. Do we in our body? Or do we have the proper right balance of things, because it could affect our personality? When we talk about chemical imbalances, we actually uh, we're talking about the same kind of physical influences, but for us, it's we look at the small. We look at the smallest influences, right? So, and there's even a lot of the same kind of warnings, right? You can have a vitamin D deficiency, and it can cause you to be depressed in the winters, because you're not getting enough sun, and that vitamin D deficiency, and you always get that warning. You'll get a warning. Well, don't let it become an excuse, but you should still be making sure that the influence of the vitamins and the minerals in your life, or the hormonal influence in your life, um, we have we have the same sort of understanding of influence, but it's just not the same integrated influence. And so I think it would be interesting to really think deeply about what would it look like to think Christianly about those sorts of influences on our body, that influence our personality, influence our soul, rather than um, a sort of you know just thinking, well, no, that's just reality. Those influences are just reality. We don't have to do any sort of philosophical work to think about those. Uh, uh, but how do we take our understanding of influence on our personality, influence on our fortunes, influence on our ability to work, and think Christianly about those things? And I think that the medievals give us a good guide by the way that they break down their understanding of influence, and then try to um, submit it to a Christian understanding of the world. Now, I do think that there is actually uh, evidence too that there is a cosmic influence from the planets. I know that in large police stations on a full moon, they put extra police officers on, because there's a lot of issues that come about on a full moon, and we don't really understand. There's something mysterious about the influence that the moon has. We know that it does, that our bodies do feel it. If somebody lives without seeing the sun long enough, that their sleep cycles switch to when the moon is down and when the moon is up, right? So if when they're trapped in a mine for a long time, their sleep cycles come to align with the moonrise and the moon set, right? So our body does feel the effects of the moon, for example. So uh, they 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 aren't just completely making things up, but it is actually still a mysterious thing and hasn't really gotten the sort of that sort of study. Uh, so we can't just dismiss it as if it's nothing. But I do think the most helpful thing about it is when we see the way they interacted with an understanding of the world's influence on our personality and on our body. Um, that they did a much better job of trying to make sure that they had an integrated understanding of their faith, as well as the influences of the world.